Hi, everyone. On today's podcast, we're going to talk with Nathalie Walton, CEO of the Expectful app, about coping with anxiety during pregnancy and postpartum. Welcome to the Evidence-Based Birth Podcast. My name is Rebecca Decker, and I'm a nurse with my PhD and the founder of Evidence-Based Birth. Join me each week as we work together to get evidence-based information into the hands of families and professionals around the world. As a reminder, this information is not medical advice. See evbirth.com/disclaimer for more details. Welcome to this episode of the Evidence-Based Birth Podcast. Before we get started, I just want to give a brief content warning. Towards the beginning of this podcast, we will be talking about an experience of birth trauma with placental abruption, emergency cesarean, and NICU admission. And now I'd like to introduce our honored guest, Nathalie Walton. Nathalie is the CEO of Expectful, the #1 meditation and sleep app for growing families. She has spent the last 8 years in leadership roles at Airbnb, Google, and eBay. As a new mother to her 10-month-old son, Everett, Nathalie experienced the failure of the U.S. healthcare system as it pertains to nurturing the mental and emotional well-being of pregnant and new mothers. She joined the team at Expectful to provide universal access to evidence-based wellness solutions, such as meditation, that help millions of women around the world navigate the new stage of parenthood. Welcome, Nathalie, to the Evidence-Based Birth Podcast.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here today.
So I'd love to hear your journey to parenthood, including your pregnancy and birth story. I know you've talked about it with other news outlets, but I was wondering if you could share it with our listeners.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to share more. So before I got pregnant, I read this research report, and it shared how the physical intensity of pregnancy is like basically running a 40-week marathon. It's actually a really great study, and what it shows is just how pregnancy is truly the greatest race that a woman might face in her lifetime. And so as I was going into pregnancy, I was prepared for this marathon. I knew it would be a long race to the finish line. And even though I prepared for this long, arduous ride, I didn't take into account that some pregnancies can be marathons on flat roads, on a cool, crispy day, or others can be like entirely uphill in desert-like conditions. And so my pregnancy, it started on a flat road on a cool, crisp day, and it was pretty uneventful until my 20-week scan. And it was at my 20-week scan where I found out that the rest of my journey would be entirely uphill, basically climbing up a steep mountain in the Kalahari Desert. That's because right around the midpoint in my pregnancy, I was told that I had elevated inhibin and HCG levels, and that I would need to be monitored pretty closely for the rest of my pregnancy. And, you know, what was really frustrating, and actually how I came to use evidence-based birth, was around the fact that none of my doctors could actually tell me what this meant. They just said, I think you have placental challenges.
And what was the exact thing that they were telling you that you had?
All that they knew was from a test that I had elevated inhibin and HCG levels. People that have those levels, higher levels, they're more inclined to have placental challenges.
Okay.
And so that was all I really was told, was like, there's not one thing wrong with you, but just like, we have to monitor you because there could be challenges associated with these higher than normal levels.
So all of a sudden you were kind of considered high risk?
All of a sudden, before this time, I did my yoga 5 times a week. Like I ran or walked 10,000 steps a day. Like I was smooth sailing. But then all of a sudden I went from being incredibly healthy to high risk. It was really jarring. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, what that meant for me at the midpoint of my pregnancy was that I went from like the regular doctor's appointments that you have to endure to really like going to a maternal fetal medicine doctor, almost like on a weekly basis. And then once I hit my 3rd trimester, I was going into the hospital pretty much every single day of the week for NST tests and Dopplers and appointments with maternal fetal medicine specialists and my OB. And it was really at that point where I just experienced a tremendous amount of stress. And I didn't know what to do. It's like, I think if you're in that position and you're told you have a high risk pregnancy, at some point there's this feeling of like, what can I do to help? What can I do to ensure the best possible outcome for my baby? And when doctors say like, you know, there's really nothing that you can do, we just have to keep monitoring you. that's a really helpless place to be in. And it really caused me a lot of stress. And so, I mean, every week that my pregnancy continued, I viewed it as another week that we survived, like one step closer to the finish line. So the birth date happened to be like on a Saturday. So like every week that we got a Saturday hit, I would be so fortunate to receive these emails from all of the apps saying like your baby is the size of a pineapple. And I just felt so grateful because every week, every Saturday I got to with my baby still inside meant like we were still doing well. And so that was like that was the yardstick that I used to measure my pregnancy. And it just created a lot of stress. And so at some point, I decided to shift my energy to what can I actually control? Because I really felt like I couldn't control a whole lot at that point. And the more I researched, I realized like what I can control is my mental well-being and preparing for this birth. And so I poured all of my energy into that. On the mental side, I started using Expectful. I've always had a meditation practice and I've used it throughout my life to help keep me grounded during stressful times. But what I really found was that Expectful's meditations that are guided on a week by week basis for pregnancy, they really helped me cope with my stress when really nothing else could help me. To me, the most amazing thing happened. So, like every week, I'd go in for these monitors, like pretty much every day, and I'd see myself like getting progressively worse, and there was nothing that I could do to stop it. But at the point where I stopped meditating, my condition kind of stabilized. So,
When you started meditating, you mean?
yeah. I mean, about within a week, it was pretty amazing. I don't know what I can attribute that to. I mean, I think probably a reduction in stress, and I think that read a lot of research that does show that meditation has a really positive impact on the outcome of stress. And so, like, if you can imagine the stress that one is going under in a high risk pregnancy, I think that it's possible to conclude that like meditation does have a really positive impact on that condition. And so I think Expectful's meditations were really key in helping me get to the finish line. For that, I'm so grateful. But I said one of the things I also decided to focus on was preparing for birth. So I think one of the challenges that I faced was having a high risk pregnancy kind of means that like at least from a doctor's perspective, they very strongly feel that you should give birth in a hospital. And so from the very beginning, like I was determined to have an unmedicated birth. And so I was in this situation where I thought, how can I have an unmedicated birth and I'm high risk? Like, what can I do? And so I hired a doula who's fantastic and really helped me come up with a plan to still have an unmedicated birth in a hospital environment. And one of the things that I discovered to really mentally prepare me for doing this unmedicated birth was hypnobirthing. And so in addition to my meditation practice, I was doing hypnobirthing every night. And really like by the time I got to pregnancy, I was just like in this, the time I got to birth, I was like in this very zen state with a combination of hypnobirthing and my daily meditations. And, it really helped me get to that finish line. And so point came where I actually went into labor and I experienced cramping one evening. I pulled out my app and I started doing my meditations and I started doing my hypnobirthing. And I was so deep into the breathing that I didn't even realize that I was in full blown labor. And it wasn't until my water broke that I realized like, oh, wow, I'm about to give birth. And that's really because I was just so deep into the breathing exercises.
And how many weeks were you at this point?
Yeah, at this point, I was 38 weeks. So like
okay.
I was
You made it to term.
I made it to 38 weeks, which was like, to me, getting to 38 weeks was such a blessing. I found out at week 20 that I was high risk. And so I think it was like around 150 some odd days that I like had to have this mentality of just one more day, one more week to get to that finish line. But really, through meditation and trying to reduce my stress and staying focused on what I could control, I did make it to 38 weeks in one day. And so for that, I'm very fortunate. But just getting back to the point where I was started realizing that I'm in labor after my water broke and after enduring like probably 8 hours of cramps, I realized that I needed to get to the hospital rather quickly. That was the advice that I received from my doula and my doctor, just based on everything that had happened in the past 38 weeks. And so as we drove to the hospital, like, I was in discomfort, but like I was surviving. And when I arrived at the hospital, like I could barely walk. I saw a wheelchair. Someone came to me with a wheelchair, and I've never been more grateful to to be wheeled in my entire life. But I was wheeled to the room where they examine you, and I actually found out that like upon arrival, I was 8 centimeters dilated. Which to me like felt like a huge win that I had gotten to 8 centimeters dilated at home without any intervention. And when I was working with my doula, like I think we had just planned to get to like 5 centimeters. And so like here I was like almost at the finish line. And at this point, like I was still very much focused on an unmedicated birth, even though the pain that I felt, I thought maybe I would change my mind. But fortunately, I had my doula, I had my husband reminding me that, Nathalie, like, this is what I prepared for. I can do this. And so I refused an epidural. And I just kept doing my hypnobirthing and I kept breathing deeply. I used nitrous oxide, which to me was so helpful because it just allowed me to even focus on my breathing even more. All I had to do was like inhale the gas and when I was having a contraction. And it really allowed me to get through the deepest pains of labor unmedicated. I started at 8 centimeters dilated in the hospital. I got to 9 centimeters dilated. And then I got to 10 centimeters dilated. And like I was about to push. And as soon as I started pushing, my doula noticed like a pretty massive blood clot. And I couldn't really see what was going on, but I could tell by the expression of the people's faces in the room that something was very off and that this situation was becoming very dire. And to be honest, like I really was not aware of what was happening during my birth. Like I was so focused on breathing that like I didn't realize that there were issues going on. My husband and people in the room were like, you were just so dialed in to your birth that like you weren't aware that you were having a placental abruption. And so when I started to push and I had this blood clot, it became apparent that like I was losing a lot of blood, and that my son Everett was in a dangerous position. And so really without even realizing it, within seconds, I was wheeled into operating room for an emergency C-section. It was not what I wanted. I really desperately wanted to have this unmedicated birth. I was so close, but it was what I had to do. And what made this really difficult was really my refusal of the epidural. So I think most time when women have C-section, they have an epidural. And so like, I just went under. And the last thing I remember is being wheeled to the operating room. And then like several hours later, I wake up and like, I don't have my baby with me. I don't know where he is. I'm just in a room. I don't know what happened. I didn't even know if I had a baby. And so it was a really scary situation. Fortunately, my son came out fine. He was just taken to the NICU. I got to see him several hours later. I definitely had a long recovery from that emergency C-section. And it was like definitely a turn of events that I had not planned for, which caused a lot of stress in the following weeks. But when I look back on it, I am fortunate that I was so dialed into meditation and that I was so dialed into hypnobirthing, because it really allowed me to focus on the very few things that I could control in like such a dire situation.
So how long did your baby stay in the NICU for?
Yeah, so my baby was in the NICU for 2 weeks, and we left just shy of his due date, 2 days shy of his due date.
Mm-hmm. And what was the reason he had to stay in the NICU?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the challenges of having a placental issues as I had, and honestly, to close the loop here, is we didn't really realize that what was happening to my placenta until actually after I gave birth. And so like I was being monitored for elevated inhibin and HCG that might have an impact on my placenta.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't until I actually had the placenta abruption that we could, after the fact, say like, okay, your placenta was challenged during birth. And so what that indicates and what that meant for us was that he was born on the smaller side. And so we were in the NICU to get him to a size where it was safe to go home.
Okay. And were they able to like examine the placenta afterwards to find out what was going on with it?
I mean, that was something that I asked for, but here's the reality. It's like I was out cold. I wasn't present.
Mm-hmm.
And when I asked for it after the fact, like I'm not really even sure what happened. And I couldn't advocate for myself, obviously, if I'm under general anesthesia. And in those kind of situations with an emergency C-section, at least at the hospital where I was in, no one was allowed to be in the operating room. And so like I didn't have my husband advocating for the placenta, my doula. So it was probably a little too late. And at that point, when, you're really in such an emergency situation, I think the only thing everyone was focused on was like,
oh yeah. What I was kind of referring to is just like, sometimes they'll do like, almost like the doctors will send the placenta to the lab, to check it out.
That's part of my frustration with the entire, medical situation. It was something that I requested, but something that
didn't happen. Not that you know of. Okay.
Which is something like I think I found time and again that advocating for yourself in pregnancy is something that one has to, especially one that's in a situation like mine, has to advocate for themselves, because people aren't really thinking about necessarily what's best for you and following up on your own needs.
So your baby was in the NICU for about 2 weeks. What was it like parenting your baby during that time?
Whew. Parenting a baby in the NICU, for me, it was a challenge. It was a challenge for a couple of reasons. For me, I found parenting a baby in the NICU to be a challenge because the first thing is like, I was separated from my baby, and I was separated from him in a time where you're supposed to be, or I mean, in theory, like you're supposed to be attached to your baby. And that was really hard for me to swallow. Like I had just given birth. I think it was maybe 5 or 6 hours before I even had the chance to see my son. And that separation was really difficult for me. So we were on a different floor. The L&D, labor and delivery floor, was in a separate wing than the NICU. And so like even physically getting to the NICU to see my son was a huge exercise. That's because like I couldn't walk. I just had like this really emergency C-section. And so in order to visit my son, I had to ask for a wheelchair and I had to be wheeled. And the whole ordeal would take about like 20 minutes or so to get me to the NICU. So just the separation, like that was really difficult for me. And I think that the separation also had further implications as it relates to breastfeeding. So I always planned to breastfeed, like it was something that I was very excited about, but I didn't plan for having this emergency situation. And so like, I don't think my body was prepared to make milk right away. And I think also the stress and the trauma from what happened really made it challenging, like as it pertains to my milk supply. And also it made like being so separated, made skin to skin contact really difficult. And so I really struggled with breastfeeding for about 15 weeks, to be completely honest. I was doing triple feeding for 15 weeks, which is, I would not wish that on anyone. And for anyone that doesn't know what triple feeding is, it's breastfeeding, bottle feeding, and pumping. And when I looked at one of the apps that I use to track how much time I spent like breastfeeding, pumping, and bottle feeding, I think by week 9, it showed that I had spent over 8 full days doing this, which is like 8 full days of 24 hours. And this was just at week 9. And so like, I couldn't believe the amount of work that I was spending to get there.
After you were kind of starting to recover, were you hospitalized for the full 2 weeks too, or did they discharge you before your son?
Yeah, so I was in the hospital for 5 days, which is, I think, standard for a C-section. And, I think so I said like the separation was difficult for me, but a big part of that was like being a mother to a NICU baby. it's your own physical discomfort, especially if you go through an emergency C-section. I mean, like I mentioned, I couldn't walk. I had to be wheeled around. Like I couldn't sneeze or cough, and I gave birth at like the middle of or at the end of December, which is like kind of flu season. And so like the fear of coughing even to was something that was a risk for me. And so like I still needed to recover. Like I mean, I was only in the hospital for 5 days, but I felt like I needed a good 6 weeks to recover. Like getting in and out of bed was hard. Going to the bathroom was really difficult. And so that was another thing that was so difficult about the NICU was just my physical inability to be present.
Was it, so I know a lot of NICUs are changing to have like private rooms where the parent can room in. Was that the case where you were, or after your discharge, did you have to go home and then just come in to visit your baby?
Yeah, so fortunately, my NICU did have a private room situation. But that being said, I had just recovered from surgery. Like I didn't want to sleep on
A recliner?
pull-out couch.
Yeah.
And like really, I think the advice that I got from the NICU nurses, advice that I would give to any parent that's going through the NICU is that use that time to take care of yourself. If I had stayed overnight in the room with my son, I would not have been doing anyone a favor. Like I'd have the bright lights, I'd have people coming in to interrupt my sleep. And like I think when we got home, I would have been in an even worse state. So like I took advantage of the fact that my baby was in the NICU. He was with some of the best doctors in the world. And so like I went home at night and I slept and I took care of myself. And I think something that made me feel better about the whole situation was one of the nurses said that the NICU is like having the most expensive babysitters in the world, and so like don't feel bad about leaving your baby here to take care of yourself. And so I really appreciated that, because like had I not been able to sleep in my own bed, I don't know how I would have really made it.
Yeah, I guess you had just gone through like a life-threatening event and you were recovering from that.
Yeah.
And you needed that sleep. So it sounds like you were making a decision so that you could then care for your son after you came home. So what was it like bringing your baby home then?
Yeah, I mean, I think bringing a baby home was, we were so relieved to bring him home. Like, I think coming home from the NICU without a baby, so like that span of after I got discharged before Everett came home, that was really one of the loneliest times I've ever experienced in my life. I just did this and like, I felt like I should be coming home with a baby, and yet I was coming home by myself, and that was really lonely. So it was a very joyous occasion when we were able to bring Everett home. But then, we were thrown into it like all new parents are, and it was really difficult. Like we had no idea what to expect. We didn't realize that we would be up all night for like the next several weeks and actually months. Everett just turned 11 months, and like even though he's sleep trained, I still don't get a good night's sleep. And so there's just so much that even though he was home, we were like wildly unprepared for, even though I felt like I had prepared so much.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like what you experienced, was a birth trauma, and that you had that, threat to your life and your baby's life. How did you cope with that experience? What steps did you take to heal?
Yeah. So, what I would say about this, and for anyone that does experience a birth trauma, is that it can take a very long time to heal. So like I'm 11 months away from my son's birth. And like, it really wasn't until probably 6 months past his due date, or past the time he was born, that like I really started realizing that like, oh, maybe something really traumatic happened to me that I had to address. Because in the months immediately following his birth, I was so focused on just being present for my son and taking care of him and breastfeeding, and that I didn't really have a chance to take care of myself. And so I bring that up because people that do experience birth trauma, like it can take a long time to resolve. And so the steps that I did, one of the things that helped me the most was I was a part of a mother circle. And it was like really in that mother circle where I met with many other mothers. Most of them didn't have a traumatic birth, but in that circle, we often shared like the struggles that we were going through at the time. And having that camaraderie with other women that had babies that were born within a couple of weeks of my own really helped me prepare to be the best mother that I could. And knowing that what I was going through was not unique in terms of like raising my son, not the birth trauma, and just providing that support. But to really answer your questions, like how did I deal with the birth trauma? I mean, I think that some of the best ways to deal with that. So, like, I've used a lot of Expectful's meditation. We have these fantastic meditations on birth trauma, but also through therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Is that was something that I found to be really helpful because inside, I really felt like a lot of this was my fault, when in reality, it wasn't my fault. I mean, I was doing everything that I could do to get to a healthy birth, but there's definitely some element of blame that I felt for myself. And so it was really therapy that helped in combination with meditation.
And it sounds like it's fair to say, like, you're right, you're still in the healing process because it can take years to recover from a traumatic birth. But it sounds like you're working on it, which is really important, and getting help.
Yes. I think for people that go through birth trauma, I would absolutely recommend therapy because there are a lot of like wounds that can be hidden, and that you can see come up in your life in many different ways post birth. And that's what I started to see, that like months after I gave birth, I realized like I'm still not okay. And part of it was when I was in my mother's circle, I would ask my facilitator, I'd ask other moms saying like, I'm facing an exhaustion that I don't think is normal. Like, do other people have this? And I kept asking that question week after week. And at some point, I think my facilitator was like, Natalie, I think at this point, like you actually might want to get help. Like it sounds that your exhaustion might not just be a normal exhaustion.
It's not just sleep deprivation from parenting.
Yeah, it's not just sleep deprivation. And I realized it was really the stress that I was harboring due to what happened to me. And so it was therapy that helped me really start to recover from that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. In your mother's circle and in your work at Expectful, have you noticed that a lot of parents seem to struggle with anxiety or stress during pregnancy, especially during COVID?
Oh my gosh. Yes, I have noticed that. So we recently, Expectful did a survey with 1,000 pregnant and new mothers, and we found that 76% of pregnant and new moms struggle with stress and anxiety during pregnancy, particularly as it pertains to COVID. I saw research from that study that showed that 68% of pregnant and new moms struggle with sleep, in particular due to COVID. And so at Expectful, I've seen that this is something that pretty much, I mean, the vast majority of women are facing, whether they're trying to conceive, whether they're pregnant or they're new mothers. And so, yes, it's a period that is stressful to begin with, but I think COVID obviously exacerbates the stress.
Mm-hmm. And what are parents stressed about?
I think that's a great question. I mean, if you think about the time that from a woman conceives to like really the end of the first year, I mean, and you think about all of the changes that this woman undergoes. So her body grows, like her hormone shift, her sleep fluctuates in pregnancy, and also definitely in postpartum. This sleep is definitely an issue, but just like the structure of her family changes, like there's really not a period in life when one goes through as much change as one does when they give birth. And so I think that change naturally causes a lot of anxiety and stress. But I think that there are other factors that are making women more stressed. And so I honestly, I think that the biggest driver of stress for pre and postnatal women is really our cultural failure to support mothers during a time of such momentous change.
Mm-hmm.
And so I look at things like maternity leave. I mean, I was fortunate to have a very good maternity leave, but when I look at other countries, like I look at my peers and colleagues in the UK, like they have 52 weeks of maternity leave. And so I just think about what if I had that kind of time to really return to normal before starting to work again. But also I think it's just the structural challenge of actually finding support. I mean, when I think about my experience of finding a doula, I found a doula only by asking my OB. She gave me a list of 10 doulas, and I had to call or email or text 10 doulas in order to find one that I wanted. And the whole process took me 20 hours. And I just think about every other thing, or most services today have been automated. I mean, you can get a car via Uber, you can get your groceries delivered via Instacart, but why is finding care for such an important time, like a doula or lactation consultant, why is it so broken and offline and has never been innovated? And so like, I think that that's another problem that really creates a lot of stress, is just how this world of support for maternal support it just has not been innovated in a very long time.
Well, and it used to be, I mean, there was kind of a break in the natural way how that sport was structured. It used to just be part of your family and your community. But now, as
Absolutely.
society, our culture has changed and become more fragmented, you have to like hire professional support. And it's not, your auntie next door or whoever, or your sisters. Like, we don't see birth, we don't see breastfeeding or chest feeding. And so it's all new when we experience it for the first time. Whereas
Yes.
in past, and our ancestors, you learned it from a young child, what it was all about. And you were surrounded by your support system. So I
You
agree.
are. Yeah, you
Yeah.
absolutely are. I mean, I just think about breastfeeding for me, and I really did struggle with breastfeeding. I mean, my baby was small, which makes it a little bit more difficult to latch, but I also had to start pumping because I was in the NICU, or my baby was in the NICU and I was separated. And I think that I saw about 9 different lactation
So you didn't
consultants.
have like a continuity of the same person.
Well, I did, but it wasn't working. I wasn't getting the results that I needed. And so
Oh.
I just like,
Kept trying
after
to find the right person.
I just kept trying. And I'm so fortunate that like I had the resources and the time and energy to do so. I was so determined. But like this entire time during postnatal experience and finding like a lactation consultant so that I could breastfeed, I kept thinking like, what do people do that don't have these resources? Like,
Hmm.
I mean, how are women like set up to succeed? And just like the reality is flat out that they're not. And so, I
It's
mean,
not that people are falling through cracks. There's this giant wide open canyon that everybody falls into almost.
everyone falls through it. Everyone. I mean, I recently read a study that said 92% of new mothers struggle with breastfeeding in the first week of life. This is like not, you're right. Everyone is falling through that canyon. It's not just the cracks, that everyone is suffering.
Yeah. So tell us about your role at Expectful. When did you arrive there, and what are your hopes for what you want to achieve there?
Yeah, so I arrived at Expectful in September, and it's really, I came there, I mean, through having used Expectful during my own pregnancy. And as I've spoken, really found the value that it provided to me. And so I started advising Expectful just as like a fun side project while I was on maternity leave. And I just formed a really close relationship with the founder, and it made sense for me to come on as the CEO. And so I joined in September. And really, I mean, it was my traumatic experience as a pregnant woman, as a new mother, and really around the experience that I had of finding the support that I need, that motivated me to want to come to Expectful. And so, really, what I'm trying to do is bring support to women that need it. I mean, today, Expectful, it provides that support through meditation and sleep. But as I think about the next year, I'm doing a lot to expand that support. So, in January, we're launching mother circles because that was something that was critical for me as my journey to new motherhood. We've also recently launched live meditations for women that are trying to conceive, and pregnant women. And we're providing that community where people can come together and talk about their shared experiences. So I'm motivated to fix this big gap in the canyon that we see of that most women fall through. And I'm really coming to provide that support and a focus on a woman's well-being, not just her baby, but how does the woman thrive.
Hmm. So what's available at Expectful? So it's meditations for pregnancy, sleep, parenting, and you said you have for people struggling with fertility issues. Is there?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so we have the world's largest library of meditations for trying to conceive, for pregnancy, and for new mothers. One of the most popular areas of Expectful is actually around sleep, which is not surprising because, I mean, sleep for new parents is something that is so difficult to come by. But even myself, I really struggled with sleep. as a pregnant woman. I mean, perhaps it was due to the stress, perhaps it's due to the heartburn, but like I really did struggle with sleep in pregnancy. And another thing that we just launched is hypnobirthing. So hypnobirthing to me was transformative. I mean, it was life changing. The power to experience an unmedicated birth. I don't think I've ever felt more powerful than my experience. And that's why I'm really excited that we launched hypnobirthing last month. And so that course is now available on Expectful.
That's awesome. How can parents try out the Expectful app?
Yeah, so there are several ways to try out Expectful. One can go to expectful.com. We're also available on the Apple App Store, on Android App Store as well.
And is there a scholarship program?
Yes. I mean, I think one of the challenges that I really am hoping to solve is that I want to provide access to well-being for everyone, regardless if one can afford access or not. And so Expectful has what we call a Helping Hands program, where anyone that can't afford the Expectful membership can get free membership by reaching out to us. And all that one has to do is email care@expectful.com, and we will make sure to get them complimentary subscription to Expectful within 48 hours.
Oh, well, that's amazing. Yeah. Nathalie, do you have any words of wisdom, after everything you've experienced in the last couple of years, for parents who are entering birth or parenthood soon?
Yeah, I do have advice, and this is based on like everything kind of going wrong. But my advice to aspiring mothers and is to let go of expectations. The road to becoming a mother, it can be a beautiful road, it can be a difficult road, but the thing that's important to remember is that there's so much that is out of one's control. And so letting go of expectations up front, I think, will set up mothers for success. And the sooner that one can embrace the unpredictability that accompanies creating a human life, I believe that the more strength one will have to conquer any unforeseen circumstances. And my last bit of advice would be to focus less on the material objects that accompany birth and getting into parenthood. I mean, I spent so much time thinking about, do I have the right crib? Do I have the right stroller? Do I have the right burp cloths? And the reason I spent so much time on this was because it was like something I could control. And like I had the power to make sure that I was doing the best that I could for my baby. And that felt good. But I would say in hindsight that I focused a lot less on my mental well-being and like just preparing mentally for the transition that I would have to motherhood. And, you actually can prepare for that. And I think you can prepare by meditations. You can prepare in many other ways, just changing your mental outlook. And so I would just encourage mothers to focus less on the material items and focus on preparing themselves for this beautiful and challenging transition of entering motherhood.
So it's more about preparing yourself, educating yourself, and gathering your support team than it is all the physical trappings of parenthood that society tells us we need, all of the latest and greatest gadgets and baby gear.
Absolutely. I think that is 100% correct, is focus less on the material and focus more on your support and your well-being.
And I'm curious, I know at the very beginning of our discussion, you mentioned that you experienced, the failures of our healthcare system. Like, what do you see those failures were in your situation? I know you had a life-threatening event and you and your baby did survive. So where were the failures in the system, and where do you see we need to work on in our country?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are so many failures that it's hard to list, but I'll try to highlight a couple. So I think one of the biggest failures in medicine is, at least how I experienced it myself, was the human error that is involved in pregnancy. And I say that I encountered a lot of false positives and false negatives as it pertained to my ultrasounds. So like I was constantly being monitored. The Dopplers are like, and the NST test, like you're being monitored very frequently. And when you're being measured, it's like a human is measuring you. And I had a couple of experiences where like my measurements were really off and they'd cross a threshold where it would sound an alarm. And I'd come in the next week and we'd be fine. And like I'd ask, help me explain this. And really it just became clear to me that it was human error. And so like I think that is a really big failure of medicine as it pertains to pregnancy. So that's one. And then I'd say the other is just probably around lack of transparency and information. So like I frequently would go to evidence-based birth to have my questions answered. Like, I mean, I went through a lot, and so I had many questions. And when I'd ask my doctor for advice, some of the advice I would get was like, well, I had 2 patients in my 20 years of working, and like, this is what they did. And so like, this is what I would recommend that you did. And I mean, that's great, but like, let's look at some evidence here. And so I think that there's just a human disposition for not looking at holistic evidence and rather just giving like anecdotal advice. And so I'd say that that's another big failure of the medical system. Like those are probably the 2 biggest challenges that I faced.
And when you were describing kind of like the atmosphere in your appointments and the all the testing that you had to go to, it sounds like it almost created like a hypervigilance, like a hyper awareness that could actually be detrimental to your pregnancy, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I feel that was really the case. That was absolutely a challenge that I saw in my experience.
Yeah, and it's hard because you want to do the best you can as your parents. So like, yes, I'll come to every single appointment. What do you want me to do? But at the same time, that kind of there's that balance of tracking the pregnancy and seeing what's going on, but also like overly stimulating your anxiety, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it absolutely makes sense. And I really feel that it was more of like the healthcare system wanting to protect themselves.
Do you think there was a little bit of a liability reason?
Yeah, I felt like a liability, like because this one time we made this human error and we saw that you were high risk, you now have to come into all of these appointments so that you can't sue us. Even though coming into all of these appointments, like 5 days a week, spending 2 to 3 hours in an appointment a day, and having to miss work, like even though that probably will cause you more stress, you have to do this now. It's just from like a liability perspective. Honestly, that's what it felt like, was that it was I don't want to say over, it was almost like an over medication of my pregnancy from a liability perspective, which created even more stress. And it's, as you mentioned, I mean, you want to do what's best for your baby. Of course, I want to show up to these appointments, but at the same time, did I need to show up to all of those appointments? Like, I don't think
did they have to happen at the frequency that they did?
Now,
obviously you had some placental issues, although you'll never really know exactly what was wrong with the placenta.
I never will. But my Dopplers, my NSTs, all of my tests, they were normal. They were normal tests.
Okay, normal.
So like nothing was ever flagged to be wrong. So I mean, I was just like, I was going to these appointments, I was following all orders, but I really kept questioning, like, why? What is really going on that is so wrong? And so that was just an answer that like I never got. And I don't think that most people will get that in the medical system, probably because due to liability.
Yeah.
To be honest.
So Nathalie, thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your experiences. Is there anything else you want to share before we go?
No, I mean, I thank you so much for having me on. I really benefited from evidence-based birth, and I appreciate the nature of evidence. I would take some of the printouts and I would bring them to my doctor, so I was more informed. So I really appreciate what you're doing, and you're really helping to close that gap in care for women. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nathalie. This podcast episode was brought to you by the book Babies Are Not Pizzas, They're Born Not Delivered. Babies Are Not Pizzas is a memoir that tells the story of how I navigated a broken healthcare system and uncovered how I could still receive evidence-based care. In this book, you'll learn about the history of childbirth and midwifery, the evidence on a variety of birth topics, and how we can prevent preventable trauma in childbirth. Babies Are Not Pizzas is available on Amazon as a Kindle, paperback, hardcover, and Audible book. Get your copy today and make sure to email me after you read it to let me know your thoughts.